know any of this. You can just go and patent some plant and then use it without sharing the benefits. So, in general line, the countries of the South, the high biodiversity countries, they demand that it has to be in every national patent law. You have to show that you have prior informed consent and that you have benefit sharing before you can patent some plants. And the current proposal is that patent applicants have to disclose the origin of the material they use to get the patent. And this is sponsored by India and Brazil, Peru, and many other countries. And especially the USA are against this, and the biotechnical industry, saying this is far too complicated and they don't know where the stuff comes from. And which is kind of hard to believe when you see how much effort they put into it, and that everything that is sampled in the jungle is actually sampled while you're holding a GPS. You know, that's very important for them to know what they did. So they do have this data, but they don't want to disclose it, because if you know this certain specimen comes from India, comes from Bangladesh, comes from Indonesia, then you can go there and ask the people, did you get some benefit? And that'll be not so nice for the biotech industry. So that was a big point in Hong Kong. What came out of it was some language that the ministerial conferences is happy that the ongoing negotiations are going to be intensified. So if you're interested in the legalese, I put some paragraph here out of the ministerial declaration of Hong Kong. And this after a whole week of negotiations, they changed the point. Here, it used to be this one
to intensify his consultative process on all outstanding implementation issues under paragraph 12b.
And this word to intensify is the result of a week-long negotiation on the Indian part. So they kind of claim that they reached something, but if you look at the scale of the problem and the point they reached here, it's rather minuscule. Another point, we want to see what our governments are doing. So what do our governments think is the most important thing about intellectual property in the world currently is apparently geographical indications. So that's where the EU was really spearheading the point and putting all their negotiation power in, the one they didn't use to be against drugs. They put it into here. And this is this is especially geographical indications are especially important for wines and spirits, Bordeaux, Champagne, whatever, Rioja, all those very nice things. Also for some non-alcoholic parts. So, and especially in favor of this is the European Union. Also, what they want is to extend the whole notion beyond wines and spirits. And who's against is New Zealand, Australia, because they have such a long tradition. The wine might be as good, but it doesn't have such a fancy name, so they can't sell as much. And so they would like to call the wine also Champagne or Bordeaux. And actually the same result, actually the same language, identical language as for biopiracy was achieved here. I don't think this is a very important point politically or development-wise. It's just a label. It's not about whether you're allowed to sell the wine or not, but to see what our government is doing there is geographical indications. Also, I want to point out two special things where the trade lawyers are very good in hiding the actually important points under seemingly innocent sounding words. One is data exclusivity. The pharmaceutical industry is very much into data exclusivity. That means the exclusivity of data coming from drug trials. One of the most difficult parts and most expensive part of developing drugs before you can sell drugs is to get a permission by some government agency that these drugs are actually doing their job. And for this, you have to do a lot of testing with actual human beings as guinea pigs. Very long, tedious, and also very problematic. I mean, you give people who actually have a bad disease, they give them a placebo to see whether the new drug has some effect or has not. So, but what the drug? Yeah, please. Yes. Please, if there are any questions, just interrupt. Should be okay.
Okay, question concerning the title, data exclusivity legalese used to deny virtual drugs. Do you mean generic drugs?
Vital.
Oh, vital, sorry. Okay. My fault, sorry.
Yeah, maybe it could be put more in focus. Okay. So what drug companies want is that nobody else can use their trial results. So that means if a generic company comes to produce a drug after the extension of the patent or to produce a drug with a compulsory license, they would have to redo all the testing. And this is not only very expensive, this is also highly unethical, because although it is necessary to use humans as guinea pigs in drug trials, it's not a very nice thing to do, and to do it more than absolutely necessary is unethical or just plain evil. But in reality, what's happening is not that they redo the test, they're too expensive, they just wait until the data exclusivity term expires, thank you. So this is not part of TRIPS so far. TRIPS says the data has to be private, has to be secret, but you can, if you have a generic drug, you can just say, my drug's the same as aspirin, I don't have to redo the trials, just see that worked, so this is going to work too. But in the free trade agreements, the bilateral agreements that, for instance, the US is doing or the European Union doing, they have stronger laws on data exclusivity, saying, for instance, in something like 5 years, 6 years, you're not allowed to use the data, even though you might have a compulsory license, yeah, because you're a country in need and you need vital drugs. Or also, it was in the WTO accession terms. You know, every country that joins the WTO can't just join WTO. They have to have negotiations, and every other country already member of the WTO has to agree. So, for instance, for China and Tonga, they had to have special agreements like this. Second nasty, tiny thing, non-violation complaints. This is something hardly anyone understands. I didn't understand it before Hong Kong. Is that there's the possibility to take countries to the WTO dispute settlement body, even though they didn't breach an agreement. This is inside TRIPS, there's a possibility to do this in cases where a country is accused of evading its obligations even without breaching the agreement itself, so by breaching the spirit of the agreement. So far, for this very unclear thing, whatever this may mean, actually, if it comes to court, there has been a moratorium. So all the parties in the WTO agreed that up until now it can't be used. And in Hong Kong, they agreed for another year not to use it, but the US and Switzerland are pushing for it to include it. And this would even more put the whole IP law under the jurisdiction of the WTO dispute settlement body. Questions like, is the IP enforcement in Germany hard enough? What about the Vorratsdatenspeicherung, data retention? Is there enough data retention in the European Union or not? Or is it a breach of American interests if there's not enough people hired in the police? All these things could go to WTO court then. We'll see. That's something where the US is pushing very hard to make this possible in the next ministerial conference in the WTO. So, at the end of the day, what happened in Hong Kong, from the parts that changed in the TRIPS agreement, one could get the impression everything stays the same, and there's a lot of truth in it, because not the important issues has been addressed conclusively, even though there has been some progress made on biopiracy. It's very, very tiny. But the point is, as we see from the very first slide we had with the data, just because IP law, intellectual property is getting more and more important, on the way to a knowledge economy, and also because of the deadlines, TRIPS deadlines expiring. Every year, TRIPS is getting more and more important and more harmful to the knowledge commons and to the developing world. And what we would really need is a complete overhaul of the agreement. Most people would agree that back in '94, when developing countries actually negotiated the TRIPS agreement, they didn't really know what they were doing. I mean, this wasn't about IP lawyers, this wasn't about artists or people from the computer industry sitting there. This was about trade lawyers back then. And if you see how engaged developing countries are now with TRIPS, they would never sign the same agreement again. So what we'd actually need would be a complete overhaul of TRIPS, and a downscaling, a very strong downscaling would be necessary. But this is not happening. So unfortunately, the whole thing is actually getting more and more important while it stays the same. And lastly, the so-called TRIPS Plus negotiations are happening in bilateral agreements. So for instance, there's a treaty between Iraq and the United States on intellectual property, which was made during the time the government were completely US controlled, and is actually very favorably of intellectual property. I mean, this is just the most extreme case, but also just a new treaty between the US and Peru, US and China on intellectual property rights. And there, all the time, this is rising standards of IP law, which causes basically net payments from south to north. If you remember the slide at the beginning where we had like $10 billion every year paying from low and medium income countries to the high income countries that way, development aid is 50 billion. So you could say that's almost 20% just going back only that way. And this is just royalties and license fees. This is not copyright. This is not the sale of computer software. So if you want to, we just have time for questions. If you want to know more, there's very good information on the webpage ipwatch.org. And for the people proficient in German, you could also go to the Attac Wissensallmende webpage. Yeah.
Thanks very much. This book is available at the Föbud shop if anybody wants to spend a few euros.
I would like to ask what would probably happen if one country simply said, okay, we don't want to be to be a part of these treaties, and also in a corporate world, if one country does that, some big companies which are originated from that country, I mean, they have subsidiaries all over the world. It's not necessary that their particular intellectual property rights stay with their original juridical person, like a big company which was founded in Germany or whatsoever. Even if if a country like Germany would refrain from those treaties, I mean, they could still pledge to use their intellectual property rights from one of their subsidiaries outside, I think.
Well, the main point with the intellectual, well, what if, well, say Brazil wouldn't enforce intellectual property anymore? Well, for example, the US could suddenly put high taxes on whatever Brazil wants to export into the US. Yes, but that's the point is intellectual property becomes a part of trade wars, so to say. Just as Europe and the US always battle about all sorts of things, they now can, well, they before as well, but they can battle also with, in terms of, I don't know, Hollywood films or whatever, which they wouldn't, but they could. So if a country like Zambia would just, after bad example because it